Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in another book tag. This is a book tag that is called the Bring Browsing Back book tag. And it sounds very curious, I must admit, it sort of caught my fancy. I was tagged to do this book tag by the wonderful and welcoming Gavin at Genre Books, and the tag apparently was created by Karen at Roving Reader, and I will subscribe to Karen's channel as I load this video later this evening. So this tag is divided into 5 different areas. The first of them is under the umbrella of the magic of discovery. For me, this is fairly a simple thing for me to look at. For me, the books that completely changed my life, that completely changed the course of my life, was for so many of us, I suppose, in that sort of late 20th century, it was Tolkien and the wider group of the Inklings, I suppose, but in particular Tolkien. I grew up in a really loving, really good, large Christian Protestant evangelical home. I was the eldest of 6, and growing up, I don't think anyone in our family thought about reading anything other than the Bible or Billy Graham. They were the only books in our home as I was growing up, I guess. Looking back on it, is it odd? I don't know. It was the norm. It was what we thought was normal. I don't think we thought about reading anything else. When I went to high school, we were very quickly put into very small, again, Christian evangelical Christian schools where we did most of our schooling. That was the dynamism that completely shaped my early life. So for me, to begin with, it was all well, I didn't read any Billy Graham as a kid, obviously, but I did spend lots of time reading the Bible. I had a beautiful illustrated Bible, which I read, and as I got into my teenage years, you read it more nobly. So as a kid growing up, other than the Bible, I was not a reader. I grew up in the Blue Mountains. We had a magical gully right behind our house, full of natural native wildlife and fauna and flora, and I spent all my time outside. I love sport, athletics, squash, rugby league. I loved everything. I struggled probably with team sports. I've always been very socially anxious, very socially awkward. So I probably excelled more in individual sports, to be honest, than in team sports. Although, I do remember as a kid growing up, it was the team sports that always caught my imagination. It was the sport that I always had all those anticipations about wanting to excel at. But for me, team sports were nearly always impossible. I was just too socially awkward, too anxious. It never worked out for me, even though, coaches could see I had some natural ability, but it was always the individual sports, athletics, squash, those sorts of sports that I probably spent a lot more time doing, I guess. But when I went to my small Christian school, and when we moved from upper primary into high school, I had this wonderful teacher, and he read to us every afternoon. We would stop everything and sit on the carpet, and he would just read to us. And he was a huge fan of the Narnia Chronicles. And that was the first time I ever read anything that just turned me on. I have a feeling that over the couple of years that we were there, he read maybe all 7 books to us in that series. And then when I got to sort of at the age of 14 or 15, I guess, I was introduced to Tolkien, and we read for study in my school The Hobbit. And oh my goodness, if the Narnia Chronicles turned me on, I don't know how to describe what Tolkien did to me. It was fantasy on a whole new level. You know, the Narnian Chronicles have their place, and I haven't read them for many, many years. Lewis, it's a hodgepodge, isn't it, the Narnian Chronicles? Let's be honest. He had no ability, I don't think, to write children. His children characters, particularly his representation of the girls, is just appalling. He had no ability to interrogate that representation of gender, his own privilege and sexism, I guess, really. But parts of the Narnian Chronicles are magical. The whole idea of the wardrobe of Narnia, even that word, Narnia, the witch, you know, the bad witch. Oh, there's just so much. The Marshwiggle, oh my goodness. There are so many characters that just stay with you. But when I was introduced to The Hobbit, wow, my whole life changed. I've never been the same since. I all of a sudden, from simply being a little outdoor kid, sport kid, a games kid, all of a sudden I got the thrill of books. And I very quickly went from The Hobbit, of course, to Lord of the Rings. My wonderful English teacher shared that love with me as well. And wow, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Oh my goodness. I realize as an adult now, looking back on Lord of the Rings, which I still love because it is such an important part of my life, it changed me completely. But I do understand from an adult point of view the representation of gender, the representation of race, of difference. There are a lot of problematic things in the Tolkien world. So I have to be very careful with my enthusiasm. But for me, you know, I do, even now, I never return to Narnia, but even now, every 2 or 3 years, I would certainly return to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I just absolutely love it. And I also love the Peter Jackson films. I think, well, I don't know, he's such a popular director, it's become trendy to maybe bag Peter Jackson out. I am not one of those people. I adore what Peter Jackson did with the films, and I love what he did with The Hobbit. The way he expanded The Hobbit out, this tiny little kid's book, of only like 240 pages or so, and expanded out into 3 huge feature-length films, sort of weaving into it parts of the Silmarillion and parts of the appendices and all those addendums that add to The Lord of the Rings and to The Hobbit. Oh, for me, absolute magic. I just love them. So for me, as I said, you know, every 2 or 3 years, I still return to Tolkien. This is the first copy of The Hobbit that I ever was given. I've had this now for, wow, about 50 years, I suppose. It is treasured. It's falling apart a little bit now. It looks in pretty good condition, but when you open it up, it's falling apart a little bit. So I don't read this particular edition anymore. I just keep it. You know, it's got the beautiful cover artwork from Tolkien. It's got the beautiful end pieces, the maps that Tolkien again drew. This is probably one of my most treasured possessions. And then Mum, my precious Mum, she could see what was happening to me. You know, my beginning of my love affair with books and the fact that I was starting to ask wrong questions, thinking about wrong things. But anyway, Mum encouraged me. She loved me to bits. And Mum, when I turned, I was either 18 or 21, I think it was when I had my 18th, Mum gave me this magical edition of The Lord of the Rings. It's in this really thin, high-grade quality, sort of like we call it Bible paper, don't we? Very thin paper. So you've got, even though it's actually quite a thin book, you've got all the 1,200 pages of The Lord of the Rings in this one volume. This, like my edition of The Hobbit, is starting to fall apart a little bit. So again, I don't read this one anymore. It is really falling apart, and it's just such a precious possession from my 18th birthday by my mum. So I sort of keep this now on my shelf. When I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings now, I have other editions that I have bought. Most recently, I've just bought from the Folio Society. I'm becoming a walking ad, aren't I, for the Folio Society. I have just bought their editions of The Hobbit the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. So now, as I return to these books, they're the editions that I'm reading. I've also bought, as a kid, as a young adult, I bought this beautiful compendium, I suppose. So this has got, by Tolkien, it's a beautiful matching edition to match the Lord of the Rings that my precious mum bought me. And this little edition has got the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which of course, oh my goodness, Tom Bombadil, what a character. It's like the Marsh Wriggles from Narnia. It's just such a strong character. And, you know, then you've got a few other things. The essay on fairy stories, Leaf by Niggle. You've got a few other little stories, fantasies, fairy stories that Tolkien wrote. The essay on fairy stories, again, as a young adult, had a big impact on me. I've always loved fantasy. I suppose going back to this was the series that really turned my life around. This is what showed me what books could do. The magic, the mystery, the wonder. And so, you know, I still return to Tolkien all the time. These are books now that I've also lived with for many times. There's, of course, the great Humphrey Carpenter, the biography of Tolkien. And he wrote this beautiful book on the Inklings, which is, of course, 1/4 of the book is on Tolkien. But there's also stuff on Lewis, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, the whole gang, if you like. I've always really enjoyed reading these. They're a lot of fun. And then the other one that I've lived with for many years now is the great Tom Shippey. He's The Road to Middle-earth. This, for me, actually, this was a really interesting book because the Humphrey Carpenter is much more biographical in their nature, whereas this book by Shippey is much more English criticism. And it's really going back to Tolkien and tracing it back, almost like an archaeologist, tracing Tolkien back through his study of philology, through his study of Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse, and really looking for the origins of the whole Middle-earth universe. So this is a magical book for me. This is what really, I think, turned me on to the academic study of English literature. It showed me, you know, it was one of the first books that I read that really showed me what, from an academic sense, you could do with books. That, you know, you didn't simply have to have a naive reader's response or personal response to a text. You could actually do something far more interesting with theory and tracing things back through their origins and looking at where ideas have come from and how they've developed. And this was a magical book. It was one of those books, one of the first books I read that really opened my eyes to the wonder of the academic study of English as a subject area. And then when I went to Sydney University, of course I studied, my 3 subjects were English, history and philosophy. And this was one of those, for me, one of those real touchstone things that showed me what the academic study of English could do. So there you go, you know, the magic of discovery. For me, it is all about Tolkien. And I return to him every 2 or 3 years. Expanding World, the second prompt. Oh, wow. For me, again, this is a pretty easy choice. Coming from my very conservative, very naive, simple Christian home, everything was very small. We weren't exposed to very much. You know, as I said, other than the Bible, it was simply Billy Graham. He was our only light to shine on any problems, any subjects, anything that happened. When I went to university, you know, I was always a very empathetic person, and I always had a real heart for the downtrodden, for people who maybe were doing things tough. And I always took the sides of those people. I was very empathetic. And so for me, when I went to Sydney University and I started bringing together history and philosophy, and I discovered Marx, oh boy. I think partly the magic of Marx for me, the discovery of Marx, was absolutely mind-blowing. You know, the fact that there were books out there that were not just Billy Graham or the Bible. And Marx, oh my goodness. For me, Marx was this great philosopher who wanted to understand the world in order to change it. You know, you wanted to understand the world so you could literally liberate the whole of humanity. The vision of the man, the great scope. And for me, you know, the commitment to the downtrodden, to giving everybody a fair go. oh my goodness, Marx just completely blew my mind. So I did kind of join the Australian Communist Party, the branch at Sydney University when I was there. Not that I ever did anything, because as I said, I was so socially awkward, so socially anxious. Joining things was never going to work for me. The only thing that I ever joined as a young adult was church, and that was because we went with a family. I was too weird, I think. My God, I shouldn't use that word weird now, should I? That's now associated with the Trumpers. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I was too weird to ever really be successful in a group. So, but yes, Marx. For me, the really great discoveries, I had a portable Marx. These books now are precious to me, but my greater library is, most of it is with my adult daughter, and part of it is still back with mum and dad. Since moving into this tiny home, I don't have room for my greater library, so it's sort of halved off into different things, and I've got to bring everything right down to what I can fit into this home. So my original big things that really just turned me on, I had the portable Karl Marx edited by the great Eugene Kamenka, which, what a name. So I just fell madly in love with this portable Marx, and Eugene Kamenka was a really good communicator, really good at putting Marx into his historical, philosophical context, giving you short extracts from Marx, and really being able to put all these extracts together for you and show you the development of the thought, the ideas. And then, of course, I very quickly, in second and third year philosophy, I moved into, in particular, Grundrisse and, of course, Das Kapital. And, oh my goodness, once I discovered those, it was like, for me, all of a sudden, discovering the Bible for the first time. I all of a sudden had this grand book, this grand vision of representing everything. And so really I was reading Marx like my mum and dad read the Bible. I was reading Marx to discover the answers to everything. It didn't matter what question you had, the answer was somewhere in Marx, in Grundrisse or Das Kapital. And the other thing that people forget, so now I've lived with these, I've just recently got, last 5 years, these 2 new biographies of Marx. This one by Gareth Stedman Jones and this one by Jonathon Sperber. They're great biographies of the man. I've really enjoyed reading these and spending time with them. Now, I am certainly not a Marxist anymore. I'm not a communist. Really, I missed my time, didn't I? If you really wanted to, as a naive idealist, fall in love with Marx as a great vision for humanity, you had to be in the very early part of the 20th century, or of course the late 19th century. By the time we started to realise what was going on, the great systems of Marxism that have simply become a system for repression. Stalin banned Finlandia from performance. Like, can you imagine that? Oh, and of course Shostakovich, all these great composers has lived in fear, as though you could write a symphony that could somehow bring the whole communist experiment undone. The social realism, the repression. So for now, yes, I'm no longer a Marxist or a communist. Unfortunately, I've lost all of that naive excitement about creating, exploring a grand vision. People forget just what a great writer Marx was. Here's a little edition I have bought recently of the Communist Manifesto. And I challenge anyone to read this and not fall in love with Marx's writing style. He just was a tremendous writer. The sense of drama, the way he was able to explore big ideas, to understand the world in order to change it. I still, every 5 or 10 years, I suppose, just for old time's sake, I do go back and reread the Communist Manifesto, fall in love with the language again, all over again. And then I've got these little things again, Gregory, Claeys and Andrew Collier, little introductions, if you like, to Marx and to Marxism, to where it's all gone in the late 20th century, going into the 21st century. They're fun for me to read because they, Marx, as I said, was so important to me. And one of the great things that's happened in the last decade is finally, Marxist historians have worked out, that there are two genders in the world and that they shouldn't only be focused on the men. So you've got this, for example, this wonderful biography by Rachel Holmes of Eleanor Marx, who was Marx's, Karl's daughter. And she became, in her own right, a really important Marxist philosopher, historian, and critic. And also an agitator. She was there right, in England in the beginning of the sort of various types of communism that got off the ground in England in the sort of late 19th century, very early 20th century. So there's this wonderful biography of Eleanor. And then, oh my goodness, a few years ago, Mary Gabriel brought out this book, Love and Capital. Such a great title. This is a sort of a biography looking at the marriage of Karl and Jenny Marx. And this book is, 50% on Jenny. And people forget what a support she was to Karl. The family lived in, Karl, people forget this. Karl Marx, he could have been a successful professor in Germany, in those German states before the unification of modern day Germany. He could have had a simple, quiet life as a lawyer or as an academic. He probably would have been more suited to academic life, but he gave it all up to pursue this dream. He was so committed to understanding the world in order to change it, to transform it. And Jenny put up with a lot. The family, they had a lot of kids, and they lived in poverty off and on for much of their life, other than the support of certain people like Friedrich Engels. So she did it tough, and she put up with Karl. She supported him, believed in him, gave him that commitment to follow through his vision for things. So this is just a magical biography. You can see it's a pretty hefty tome, but it's a wonderful study of the marriage. And while I'm looking at these marriages, Suzanne Cooper, has recently, one of my great loves from the late 19th century is William Morris, that fantastic pre-Raphaelite artist, poet, graphic designer, just an amazing person. And of course he also wrote lots of poetry right there at the beginning of the romance literature of fantasy, what we would now call fantasy. Tolkien and Lewis, they all loved William Morris, even though Morris of course was also a communist, a very committed communist. And so this book, again, to open things, for me the great biography of Morris has always been the E.P. Thompson biography. I just love it. And E.P. Thompson himself, of course, was a very important Marxist historian. But when this book came out, I was really excited. And this is, again, like that Mary Gabriel, this is a biography of the partnership, the marriage between William and his wife Jane. And this book is also opening the whole thing up, exploring the life of William Morris through his marriage to Jane, and looking at Morris through the wife, through the partnership, and looking at Jane in her own right, and what did she contribute. So this is a really interesting biography as well. And then I was really excited. Only a couple of years ago, this book came out, The Grand Hotel Abyss. What a great title. Grand Hotel Abyss, The Lives of the Frankfurt School. This is a book by Stuart Jeffries. And so this is another take on where Marxism went from the middle 20th century right up to today. The Frankfurt School, of course, were all these German Jewish Marxists who just fell in love with Marx. Nearly all of them were Jewish. And of course, most of them, the ones who were lucky enough, were able to get out of Europe before Hitler took over. And most of them ended up, of course, in the US. Many, like Adorno, ended up in academic positions in the university. So this book, the Frankfurt School are interesting, aren't they? They were really the first school of Marxism, I suppose, that began to really question the programmatic part of Marx. They probably, or at least some of them at least, I guess Adorno particularly, they really started to look at Marx again as a philosopher and look at his place in philosophy rather than as an actual political agitator. And they were looking at Marxism as a ways of understanding culture. And they were really interested in explaining, using Marxism to explain why the revolution never came. So they had a really interesting take on Marxism. You know, because from a Marxist point of view, of course, there should never have been a communist revolution in Russia, in China, you know, in Cuba. These places had never been through the right stages of economic development to create the preconditions for the revolution. So the Frankfurt School were really interested in using Marx to explore revolution, the idea of culture and history, and why the revolution didn't take place in the right places. So these guys were really interested in looking at ideology and the way capitalism perpetuates itself, reproduces itself through the culture industry. These are the people, of course, who the neoconservatives, particularly American neoconservatives, would see as the grand enemies, because these were the Marxists who got into the capitalist system. They took over all the great professors, all the great chairs in the universities, right through places like the US, and they developed all of these things about cultural studies and theory studies, and the Frankfurt School are just so important. You know, you could not understand late 20th century, 21st century culture, cultural theory, cultural history without looking at the Frankfurt School. This mad German Jewish bunch of Marxist intellectuals. But these guys did not actually have much of a program anymore about changing the world. They simply wanted to understand the world, I guess. But this is a fantastic book by Stuart Jeffries, Grand Hotel Abyss. Oh, I could just spend a lot of time re-saying the title, I think. The third prompt is open to change. I've just said that I love fantasy literature. I've spent a lot of my life, you know, when I'm not reading poetry or philosophy or history, I spend a lot of time reading fantasy. I just love it. And of course, it all goes back to Tolkien and the Narnia Chronicles, but in particular for me it was Tolkien and the transformative impact that that universe had on my life. It opened me up to this life of books and reading. So I very quickly, as a young adult, I discovered Ursula K. Le Guin. For me, I don't read a lot of science fiction. Growing up as a kid, every year we went to our local Baptist church and we would watch these Left Behind genre films. They've had a very traumatic legacy in my childhood life. Oh my God, every movie ended the same way. Those who were not saved, and I think I always knew I wasn't, I always asked the wrong questions. I unsettled, said the wrong things. Oh boy. So I think I always knew that I would be one of those who would probably be left behind, you know, wouldn't be chosen for the rapture. And these films all ended the same way. Everyone who was left behind, who didn't get caught up in the rapture, would have to choose. And you would either get a tattooed 666 somewhere on your body, and that would mark you, of course, for a complete eternity with Satan and in hell, literally. Or you ended up, and I don't know why it was the chopping block, but these films always ended with the chopping block. And if you refused to get the tattooed 666, your only way to God, your only way into heaven, was to literally go to the chopping block and have your head guillotined or cut off by the great axe. Very odd, isn't it? It was always a guillotine. Well, that's what I remember. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I've got in my memory. So for me, I really struggle with science fiction. I cannot read anything that is dystopic. It just takes me back to reliving that childhood trauma of these Left Behind genre films. I cannot do dystopia at all. I'm literally allergic to it. Margaret Atwood, you know, I've tried to read the Margaret Atwoods. No, I just can't. I'm completely allergic to it as a genre. But fantasy, I just love. So for me, Le Guin, I don't read her science fiction books. I know they're probably the more adult of her books, and they're the ones that literary critics, cultural critics get really excited about. I can't read the science fiction. I'm just not drawn to it. I'm not interested in technology, really. I'm not interested in buttons and how things work. You know, I was never a car person, never anything to do with machinery, mechanics, buttons, technology. For me, this YouTube thing, I can't believe I'm doing this and doing it on my own. I would never have thought that I would have worked out the technology. So actually for me, this whole YouTube thing, part of the wonder of it is the fact that I'm actually, to some extent, pulling it off, making the technology work. But for me, Le Guin, the mystery, the magic is, of course, the Earthsea multiverse. I just love her fantasy. All that stuff about wizards, the apprenticeship of wizards, the bringing up, the training up of a wizard, the whole magic of words, of names, and the power of knowing someone's true name. And then, of course, there are the monsters and the dragons and mazes. And, you know, in many ways, the Earthsea universe is in many ways probably a Bronze Age Mediterranean type world, you know, with the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, you know, the great shaft graves and the labyrinth beneath King Minos's palace where the Minotaur lived. In many ways, I have a feeling that Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea multiverse is really that sort of Bronze Age Mediterranean world with all those islands and archipelagos. I have a feeling that's what she had in mind. That's how I read it anyway. And what I really loved about this was I fell in love with The Wizard of Earthsea as a teenager. Just loved it. I suppose I studied it at school. I can't remember when I was first exposed to it now. I probably read it at school. But of course, Ursula Le Guin, when she started off this great adventure, she wrote the hero, the great protagonist, as male. And she just accepted that way of looking at the world, that of course a hero in a story had to be male. And what was really interesting with Ursula Le Guin is as a young adult, she really discovered feminism and different ways of looking at the world, and she realized that as a female writer, she had a responsibility also to do things differently. And so as the Earthsea multiverse expands and continues into all these other books that she wrote to add to the sequence, she started to write the hero, the protagonist, as female. And she did a lot of work on the representation of gender. And you can see feminism and her burgeoning feminism coming into the universe. And as each book is added to the multiverse, you can see how she changes and how she grows and develops on all of this. You know, she could not change the fact that the very first book was with a boy, a male protagonist, but she developed it so much more. So this book for me is another great book about change, and it really helped change me for what I was looking at. My beautiful Billy Blue is just got up. I'm not sure I'm going to get through too much of this, but maybe I'm bringing it to an end anyway. Greyhounds are notorious for, you know, being a little bit like a koala. Small bursts of energy and then 20 hours asleep in their bed. Oh, he's such a beautiful dog. He's doing a little zoomy at the moment on his bed. He's a rat bag. But, you know, being a greyhound, he's almost non-vocal, so you won't hear him all that much. But I could not live without that dog. The next prompt, this is a difficult one for me. The next prompt is browse a library, bookstore, or friends' shelves. Well, I can no longer go to a library or a bookstore unless it's online. I am never separated from Billy. I have a history of PTSD, depression and anxiety, and I literally now don't feel safe if I'm not with that dog. I'm never more than 2 meters away from Billy. I do all my grocery shopping online and have it delivered to my tiny home. I've been able to get to most of my doctors now I see via Zoom. I donate plasma at the blood bank every fortnight, and that's the only time that I'm separated from Billy. And then, believe it or not, I drive 2 hours from my home in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. I drive 2 hours all the way back to my mum and dad's place so that mum can look after my Billy Blue while I go to the blood bank, and I'm away for about 2 hours with the process, and then I'm back home to him. I'm just never separated from him. So I can't go anywhere where I can't take a dog. So I can't go to libraries or bookshops anymore, as I said, unless they're online. And friends, I don't think I'm unusual in this, but I don't have any friends. There are some people, some lovely people that I've met recently who I dog walk with, you know, other greyhound owners. So up in the Blue Mountains, I've got Tanya, and then I've got this wonderful couple that I go to as well, Rob and Darren. Tanya in particular, I spend a lot of time with. We catch up every sort of couple of weeks and we walk all our greyhounds together. She has 2 beautiful male greyhounds, and of course I've got my Billy. So we love to walk them together, and we have a lot of talks. She's a teacher who lives in the lower Blue Mountains, very close to my mum and dad's place. But other than Rob and Darren and Tanya, I don't have friends. I've never had friends. My only friend was my ex-partner. We were married for more than 35 years. It's very hard living with someone who has severe depression. For the last decade or 2, I've had almost no libido. And my mood is so up and down. I have had a very bad history of self-harming, which was very, I think, traumatizing for my partner to have to go through, to see the mess that I was making with myself, the damage, the physical damage. My poor partner had to intervene a few times and get me committed to a psychiatric hospital so that I could get the care that I needed to literally keep me alive. And it had a huge toll on her, and she was my only friend, and I've now unfortunately lost her. I took too long to get help. Years and years and years ago, she begged me to go to a psychologist. And yes, you know, it was a different time. It wasn't now where psychology, where mental health is so much, you know, on the forefront of people's minds. It's really easy now to really talk about, even as a man, it's become quite easy to talk about mental health and problems. You know, we live in an age now where, believe it or not, professional footballers who are on $1 million a year, they can have weeks off for mental health like they've got a physical injury. When I was a young adult growing up, that just would have been inconceivable. So it has changed a lot, but it is true. My partner, 30 years ago asked me to get help because she could see that I was on a crash course. And unfortunately, I just resisted it. I don't know whether it's a male thing. I just didn't want to open up. I didn't want to talk about it. I was scared stiff of tears. And there are certain things that if I talked about it, I would very quickly be reduced to tears. And I'm just worn out with crying. And I have a lot of natural social anxiety, a lot of natural social awkwardness anyway. I think coming from that sort of ADHD, very impulsive brain that I have. So I've not really ever done friends. So I don't really have anyone's house who I could go to to browse their bookshelves. I'm holding these books. Martin Buber is another great discovery. He was probably a fellow traveller with the Frankfurt School in many ways. But Martin Buber went from the philosophy of phenomenology, probably a bit of a fellow traveller with the Marxism as well, with the Frankfurt School. But Martin Buber, from existentialism and from phenomenology as a philosophy, he really developed what he called this philosophy of dialogics and looking at relationships. And he divided all relationships into either I-it or I-thou relationships. And I-it are those sort of fairly superficial transactional relationships that, represent 90 to 95% of all our interactions with people, because of our time-poor nature of things. It's not necessarily a criticism. It's just that's just the reality of how we respond to most people that we meet, most animals that we encounter. It's simply an I-it it. You know, I might be a subject, but to me, they're basically just an object, and I don't really understand their internal psychology or what's making them tick. And then, of course, as well as the I-it, there was the I-thou relationships. And I-thou were those really deep relationships where a person and an animal that they've encountered, or a person and another person on encounter, really have that deep encounter of two equal subjects meeting and really beginning to open up that inner psychology. And this has had a major impact on me, I think, because of that social awkwardness, that social anxiety I've always had in spades. The Martin Buber work on dialogics has really been transformative of me, and I suppose now the I-thou relationships that I am looking for, these really deep relationships of really opening up and encountering each other as fellow subjects. I suppose the coward in me is now looking for this through YouTube and through my poetics, my confessional poetics. And I guess I'm hoping, am I living vicariously? Yes, probably. I don't really have I-thou relationships with other people other than with my Billy. I don't have relationships with other people. As I said, I don't have friends. Is that a problem? I don't know. You feel like it should be a problem, but that's is my reality. But this work by Martin Buber, I've got these things. I've got a few collections of things by Martin Buber. This is a collection by Routledge, a selection of different things. And this is the great I and thou, which is what I was just talking about, this looking at all relationships as I, it, or I, thou. This is a beautiful book, a real meditation, opening up this philosophy of dialogics and really challenging people to search out opportunities for those I, thou relationships. To not only, relate to the people that we meet, to the animals that we encounter in our normal walk-a-day lives, not to just do it as an I, it, as a subject, and they are simply only ever an object to me. To really have that deep encounter of two subjects opening up in equality to one another. I find this a very powerful book. I try and revisit this every so often. And then just recently I've got these biographies of Martin Buber as well. This is by Morris Friedman and this is by Paul Mendes-Flohr. They're just wonderful biographies of the man. He was a wonderful German Jewish philosopher, as I said. I really enjoy Martin Buber's work and really thinking about those relationships. It does make me a little bit sad that I'm probably in my own experience of the I-thou relationship. I do it vicariously. I am hoping that in opening up to people, by really giving myself over to this confessional poetic, that if I open up as a subject with, inner psychology and emotions, I'm really hoping that vicariously I'm opening up as an I, thou to the person, the other people at the other end of the camera, or the people who are, not only watching my YouTube channel, but reading the books that I am writing. Is that a good way of translating Buber into your own life? I don't know, but that is my experience. And the last tag is to tag other people. I'm very new to BookTube. I'm not sure that I think I'm too socially awkward to tag other people at the moment. So I think I might leave that. For me, that's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit like, I can't go to a bookshop. I can't go to a library. I can't go anywhere where I can't go with my Billy. And I don't really have people that I can go and easily visit and see their lives, their bookshelves. My greater library is with my daughter, and part of it is with my mum and dad. But they're, a couple of hours away. My parents are a couple of hours away. Tanya is a couple of hours away back in the Blue Mountains. So it's hard to get to with Billy. That's what I could do for this. My way of browsing a friend's library, I suppose. A few years ago, there was this wonderful series called A Poet's Guide to Britain, by the wonderful Owen Shears, this young Welsh poet. He got this, obviously, a campaign with BBC, so it was filmed really, really professionally. It was a magical series. Unfortunately, there was only ever one season, and there were only ever 6 episodes. It was all hosted by Owen Shears. He was a magical host to bring all of this together. It was a little bit like if you knew that series, Classical Destinations. It was a little bit like that. Each episode was focused on just one poet who had a particular thing to say about a place in the United Kingdom. And then there were interviews with contemporary poets about this poet and engaging with their work. So 6 episodes, 6 poets, and then it was opened up to an experience of other contemporary people. And my book browsing via this wonderful series, one of the episodes was on Sylvia Plath, and that was when I first discovered, which I did a video on in my channel way back, Wuthering Heights. Oh my goodness, what a poem. Owen Shears in this episode, he really drilled in on that poem, Wuthering Heights. So the place was, of course, up in the moors, up in Yorkshire. And then he also looked at Hardcastle Crags and The Great Carbuncle, these wonderful other poems of place by Sylvia Plath set in the moors of Yorkshire. But in particular, he looked at Wuthering Heights. Sylvia Plath, and I just really love it. That was the first time I really encountered some of that poetry at a deeper level. And then he had an episode on Louis MacNeice. Louis MacNeice is this one. He had an episode on Louis MacNeice, that great Anglo-Irish poet who lived most of his life in London. He probably spent most of his adult life drunk in a pub. When he wasn't drunk in a pub, as you can see, he was doing a lot of writing. I think, for me anyway, to my ear and eye, Louis probably wrote a little bit too much. So it is a little bit inconsistent. But at his best, oh my goodness, some of the poetry is magical. And the episode on Louis MacNeice that Owen Shears did in this series was just a magical thing. It just opened me right up. And that's what really got me into reading MacNeice. I'd never read Louis MacNeice before watching A Poet's Guide to Britain, and now I've got the collected poems. I've got a couple of biographies and a few other things that Louis MacNeice did. I think he wrote an autobiography I've got there as well. One of my really big discoveries with A Poet's Guide to Britain was the episode that he did on George Mackay Brown, an Orkney poet right up in the north of Scotland. These little islands sort of, off the coast of northern Scotland, heading back into northern Europe, Scandinavian Europe. And of course the Orkneys were really settled by the Viking world. George Mackay Brown was this wonderful Orkney poet. My goodness, the poetry. Oh, I really fell in love with this episode. And then it had that wonderful Scottish poet Dom Patterson was one of the poets that were interviewed that talked about George Mackay Brown. A magical episode. I've spent a lot of time reading George Mackay Brown since that series. The poetry, he's written some novels, and then there's some wonderful biographical stuff that's been done on him. A really quiet voice, a really measured voice. He never travelled. He hardly ever left the Orkneys, believe it or not. So for me, growing up in the Blue Mountains, where I've just always lived with trees and the wonder of flora and fauna, it blows my mind that George Mackay Brown lived his entire life in the Orkney Islands. And so there are no trees on the Orkneys. They were all cut down, the ones that were there, because it's a pretty hard place to make a living. Very cold and windy, of course, windswept. And most of the trees that were there had been cut down, in the Iron Age, or, way back in the Neolithic even, when they were first settled by Neolithic farmers. So it blows my mind that George Mackay Brown lived his entire life, and he was in his 70s when he passed away. He also had a big problem with grog. So he passed away a little bit earlier than he probably might have if he hadn't have had this problem. But he lived his whole life basically never having seen a tree. He lived for a couple of years in Scotland. He moved down to university, and I think it was Glasgow or Edinburgh. I'm not sure where he went. I can't remember now. I have to reacquaint myself with the biographies. But apart from that brief sojourn of a couple of years in Scotland, he never left the Orkneys. He never travelled anywhere. I'm sure he would have he would have won far more prizes and had a much bigger career in sales if he had have travelled. But he just stayed in the Orkney. An amazing life. The poetry is just fabulous. So if you want a really quirky, really interesting, quiet, measured voice, George Mackay Brown, I really recommend it. And while I'm doing this series, there was one episode on William Wordsworth, the sonnet that he wrote, Crossing Westminster Bridge. It's a magical episode, actually. And then there's another episode on Matthew Arnold. Oh, Dover Beach, that poem blows you away right at the beginning of secularism, of the loss of religious faith, the loss of certainties. Dover Beach is just a magical, absolutely transformative poem. They were great episodes as well. But at the last episode that he did, episode 6, was on Lynette Roberts. Lynette Roberts actually grew up in Argentina. That's where she spent her whole childhood into her very early adulthood. But then she married a Welshman and she moved to Wales and she lived the rest of her life in Wales. As you can see, she didn't write as much. There's a big, long modernist piece in here which is difficult. But some of the shorter poems that she wrote, oh my goodness, absolutely magical. She also had a real history of mental health problems, so that was another reason why she wrote a lot less. But I hope Lynette Roberts is really remembered, and I am so thankful for the spotlight that Owen Shears shone on the life of Lynette Roberts. Without Poet's Guide to Britain and the browsing that I did through that, again, living vicariously through that BBC TV series, I would never have discovered Lynette Roberts. And oh my goodness, my life would be the poorer. Lynette Roberts and George Mackay Brown are just two voices now that I am totally in love with. I spend a lot of time reading and learning from and being inspired by wonderful, wonderful poetry. I really recommend, if you want something that's really quirky, something that maybe you haven't encountered before, we all know Dylan Thomas, and yes, he's a wonderful poet. Under Mirkwood, oh my goodness, that is one of those things that blew me away as a young adult when I first encountered it. But this is a much quieter, more measured Welsh voice. In actual fact, Dylan Thomas was at her wedding. He was one of the best men or groomsmen at the wedding of Lynette Roberts with her husband. So there you go. But she's a much quieter, more measured voice. She was madly in love, I have a feeling, with Alan Lewis, that wonderful poet who eventually passed away by suicide. He fought in World War II, and I don't think he ever quite got over the trauma of the whole thing. I suspect she was actually probably in love with Alan Lewis, another wonderful poet who I need to read more of, actually. But yes, George Mackay Brown and Lynette Roberts. Tagging other people, as I said, for me that's a little bit difficult, so I think I will leave it at that. But this has been a really quirky, really interesting book tag. I was never really sure about book tags, but I'm finding, coming into the BookTube community, I just find it so welcoming. And yes, I am living in a little bit vicariously, If I don't have real friends in the real world, I'm really interested in having friends via BookTube. So I'm so excited that Gavin tagged me to do this. Gavin's just wonderful, just like Pat from Book Chat with Pat, Ruben, and there are so many people. Emily from, I've forgotten the name of Emily's BookTube, but it's a wonderful one as well. I'm really enjoying coming into this and learning about things and being welcomed into a community and feeling part of something. I am a person, like so many people today, I'm not alone. Many of us live quite separate, quite lonely lives. And you feel like that should be a problem. I don't know whether it is. I am very happy with my own company as long as I've got Billy. I am happy with my own company, but being part of this BookTube community and being tagged in things like this, it has really opened up my life with a lot of joy, a lot of wonder. So I really thank people like Pat and Gavin for tagging me to do things and for welcoming me into this community. It's really meant a lot to me, and I'm really excited about continuing my booktube journey over the next 1 or 2 years. So thank you, and bye for now.